So I'm wondering if it's possible for me to share my screen. Yes. Okay. Looks like I can. So, I really appreciate you all reaching out to me to join you all. Like Nick said, my name is Valerie, and I have been in Chapel Hill since I was 15, and I've been at Compass Center in some way, shape, or form for the last 6 years. And so I'm the director of education programs, and I'm sure a lot of you all are familiar with Compass Center. I think our reputation for the most part is that we are the domestic violence agency that serves Orange County. But really, we have a historical connection with a couple of different agencies. So about a decade ago, the Women's Center of Chapel Hill and the Family Violence Prevention Center merged after really identifying that there were clients with overlapping concerns and needs that were accessing services in both realms. And so we now offer sort of 3 buckets of services. And I won't spend too much time here because I really want to make sure that we kind of get into the meat of this topic. But I will say that, our self-sufficiency services, while available to all, community members, regardless of whether or not they identify as survivors of domestic violence, that they are critical for people who've experienced domestic violence. And one of the reasons for that being is economic abuse, which is what we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about, because unfortunately, even though it's so pervasive, it's not really what comes to mind, when people think about domestic violence, but it's one of the single most prevalent and determining factors when it comes to a survivor's ability to leave an unsafe situation and then maintain stability and safety once they've left. So I'm going to go through this presentation with you all. I really would encourage you to unmute or use the chat box to ask questions or make comments. I've got my eyes on that because I want to have this be engaging and helpful for you if you're curious about anything in particular. But I certainly intend to wrap up before the end of the hour. We're going till 2. Is that correct? I'm seeing a nod.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to allow some time for us to just have conversations as well. So I guess, the first opportunity here to engage is, what do you all think about domestic violence? What comes to mind? What are you picturing? Or even what are some of the stereotypes or, maybe misconceptions that you think are pervasive? And I'd love to hear your voice, but you can also type something there.
That it's always men attacking women. That's a misconception.
For sure.
And also that it could be physical or mental.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
And it happens in lower income families more so than higher income families.
Right. So that being another misconception. And I think a lot of what you all are naming are some of the tropes that we see most represented in media. They're things that we report most often, I think. But we do know that abuse, can happen to anybody, regardless of background and social identities. And it's important that we break the silence around these conversations and really destigmatize having these conversations so that people, especially those who are more marginalized and those who maybe don't fit the mold that we've determined to be most socially acceptable around these issues, that those people in particular, are able to access support. So I appreciate your thoughts there. And so I do want to ground us in why this is so significant. And it's because we know that 1 in 3 women in the United States will experience intimate partner violence. 1 in 4 men will experience either intimate partner violence, rape, or stalking from a partner in their lifetime. And 1 in 3 teens, regardless of gender identity, experience dating violence. And one of the really interesting conversations that Nick and I had over the phone when he invited me to come talk with you all was about the prevention education that I do. So we talk with middle schoolers about healthy relationships and recognizing the differences between healthy and unhealthy and abusive behaviors. We talk around, how do you recognize what's healthy conflict and what does that look like? And then when does conflict turn into abuse? And then at the high school level, we teach a program called Teens Climb High, which is a comprehensive sexual health program. And so we really view sex ed as a form of violence prevention, and how do we take this risk reductive model and perspective rather than one of fear mongering? So how do we raise the bar and change the conversation to set the expectation about relationships that are mutualistic and consensual, and pleasurable and healthy? How do we set the standard there? And then to bring it in a little bit closer to home and ground us in these issues, there were 61 domestic violence related homicides in North Carolina last year, and that's up from 59 in 2019. At least 11 of those homicide victims were not the intended victim, but bystanders, family members, neighbors. 3 of those victims were under the age of 18, and then there were at least 12 suicides related to those homicides, meaning that the perpetrator took their own life after killing the victim. And these statistics come from the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is out of Durham. But there's actually not really a great way for or system for tracking this. So they get these numbers based on media reports of homicides. And so that means this is definitely not fully accurate and definitely not fully representative of the public health epidemic that is domestic violence. And when I do similar presentations for first responders, one of the people that I spoke with, said, this isn't even capturing those attempted homicides, right? Those people who really suffered some severe consequences, but aren't captured here. So at Compass Center, we really strive to be inclusive of all of those folks who experience domestic violence, which can include intimate partner violence, family violence, elder abuse, child abuse. And so we define domestic violence as a pattern of intentionally violent or controlling behavior that's used by a person against a family member or intimate partner to gain and maintain power and control during and or after the relationship. So that being said, I guess what phrases or words stand out as significant here?
Control.
Mm-hmm.
Power.
Right. Intentional, right? And that is a hugely significant word because it's purposeful. Abuse is a choice, and that that intent is to gain and maintain power and control. So that's the goal, regardless of the tactic or behavior used. Any other things that stand out? So you almost got all of them. The last that I would point out is during and or after, meaning that just because someone leaves a relationship doesn't mean that the violence ends. And we don't have time to get into all of the nitty gritty. And so I hid the next slide, which speaks about lethality. And so lethality is the likelihood of a perpetrator to kill their victim. And so the highest, the time where the lethality is highest is when a victim leaves. And that's because the abuser has lost the power and control that they have worked so carefully and intentionally to construct, right? And so suddenly the victim's gone off script. And so, maybe in the past they hadn't been physically violent, and it didn't take that to be able to maintain power and control. But if a victim leaves, then the abuser might suddenly become more unpredictable and start reaching for tools and behaviors to regain that power and control. So, I won't go through this entire wheel here because one, it's hard to read because I know it's so tiny. I'm happy to share these afterwards if folks would like, but what this is a tool called the Power and Control Wheel. And it was constructed by a group at the time of all female identified survivors who got together and talked about their experiences and started to recognize patterns and were able to sort of categorize those. So what's really significant about this is that on the outside is physical and sexual violence, because as a society, those are the two types of abuse that we most readily recognize as abuse and that we've figured out how to create consequences for. So, sexual and physical violence have most often criminal implications, and whether that's assault on a female, whether that's felony strangulation, we know how to respond to that as a society. And so one of the other things that I talk about with first responders is, even if you're on a scene and there's not something that you can, arrest someone for, there's not that kind of tangible result. Are there behaviors that are not criminal, but are still red flags for this power and control dynamic that you can identify and mention to a victim? I noticed that, when we were talking to you, that your unsafe person was kind of interjecting and trying to control what you were saying, or looking over your shoulder. How does that feel to you? And so this talks to things like using intimidation, so standing in front of doorways, emotional abuse, so putting people down, calling them names, really degrading their self-esteem and sense of self-worth to the point where folks might think that they deserve the abuse. And that relates to denying and minimizing and blaming. Well, I wouldn't have to act this way, if you would just get it together, or if you weren't so crazy. And a really significant piece of this, I think, also is using privilege. So when this was initially developed, right, it was through a much more heteronormative lens. So with women traditionally being viewed as the victims and men being viewed as the perpetrators. So it said using male privilege. But I think what's important about this is to think about all the other different forms of privilege that abusers can use to exert power and control. So imagine, a scenario in which the abuser, their first language is English, but their victim's is not. And so the victim may not feel like they can access resources or even communicate with someone that they need support. Or the privilege of having a driver's license or some form of formal ID. And so your victim is limited in terms of their ability to get a job or drive. And so they could become more and more isolated. Within some LGBTQ couples, right, there can be this threat of outing someone to the community. So if a victim is not out to their coworkers or family, that could be used as a threat by their unsafe person. So it helps us really start to understand the complexities of these behaviors, but that ultimately this goal is power and control. So what I wanted to sort of tease out a little bit more, and when Nick and I discussed, he really thought that maybe a point of interest might be to talk a little bit more about economic abuse, and the impact of that and what that looks like for people. And so I'll go ahead and show these and talk through some examples, to be quite honest, to talk with, what my experience has been working with victims over the last 4 years. So there could be, impeding the victim's ability to work or seek employment. I've worked with clients whose abusers monitor their odometers. And so they know that it's 12 miles to work and back. And so if there's 14 miles on the odometer, well, then where have you been? You've got 2 miles to account for. I've worked with clients who their unsafe person requires that they call them from the landline of their office when they arrive, and it should take them 15 minutes. So if they call any later than 15 minutes from when they left the house, well, where have you been? Right? So these behaviors to control and make them account for their whereabouts. A lot of clients will report stalking at work, and that ultimately they've had to leave their places of employment because, it's been detrimental or impacted their ability to keep a job. Inflicting serious physical injuries. So we worked with a client whose abuser broke her arm before she had an interview for a promotion. And she couldn't fathom explaining that away. And so she tore her cast off her arm before the meeting because she couldn't think about how to explain that away. The next is controlling the finances. So controlling, access to resources. So, keeping names off of credit cards, off of bank accounts, off of leases, so that someone's not able to establish credit. Impeding their ability to work so that they don't have anything on their resume, right? So how would you imagine leaving a marriage or a relationship of 20 years if you've got no resume, if you have no credit history? And on the opposite end of that imagine, a situation in which when your abuser is taking out credit cards in your name and running up debt, or they're putting your name on everything, all the leases. And inevitably, when police are called for a, nuisance or a disturbance call, and that happens over and over, and you're evicted from your apartment, now not only is your credit score down the tubes, but you've got evictions on your history. So how are you going to be able to leave and find somewhere to be when there's all these financial and long-term implications here? And so I guess I wanted to talk about this because of how pervasive this issue is, but how silent at the same time it is. So 98% of victims report experiencing some form of economic abuse. So it's usually not, the reason why someone calls a hotline. They're not usually getting involved with the system or having their doctor ask them about whether or not, they're being asked to ask for an allowance. But 35 to 56% of victims report experiencing harassment at work, and 25 to 50% of them report having lost a job because of domestic violence. And so I kind of want to talk about how it's all connected to these issues. And that domestic violence and our ability to end violence is dependent upon our ability to meet clients where they are. So, a client coming to us who identifies as a, straight male client who has experienced emotional abuse, they're going to have a different story and a different outlook in terms of the resources that feel safe and accessible to them than, an LGBTQ bisexual woman who've experienced economic abuse and hasn't been able to establish credit, and they're 27, right? A Black female identified client is going to experience, a heterosexual or heteronormative patriarchal society differently than, say, you or I maybe. And so if we're really dedicated to ending violence, we have to make sure that we're thinking about how these systems are intersecting for people. And inevitably, right, in the United States, in Orange County, in Chapel Hill, we live in a capitalist society. And so your economic well-being and your financial outlook is a huge determiner or determining factor when thinking about your ability to leave. So I want you all to imagine if someone said to you, you've got to leave your house in 3 hours. That's your window of time. Your abuser's at work, or they've got an appointment, that's going to take a long time. You got 3 hours. How many of you know where your social security cards and your birth certificates are, your important documents? How many of you would know where you're going? If they, if you share a cell phone plan with your partner or with your unsafe, family member, are they going to be able to see where you're going? Would you be able to use your phone then? What about people who determine or who rely upon family members for physical independence or for getting to their doctor's appointments or picking up prescriptions? One of the biggest things that people think about is, well, where am I going to go? Because isolation and exclusion is one of the factors of domestic violence. Some people have been moved around intentionally every 2 or 3 years so that it becomes really difficult to form connections with neighbors or friends or coworkers, and they legitimately don't have anybody else to turn to. And it's really hard for me to imagine, having lived in this community for so many years, I would have a lot of people to turn to, even if it came down to, acquaintances. But for so many clients, the answer of where am I going to go or how am I going to get there? Those really basic questions is what we have to think about first. And for the last 30 years, there has not been a domestic violence shelter in Orange County. And so as of October last year, we do. We launched last year the Safe Homes, New Lives campaign, which was a capital campaign to raise money to be able to develop what we call a scattered site shelter approach. Most people, when they think about shelter, they imagine, a single home, maybe a single location where you have, people who are able to live together, and maybe, they're co-located with the intent of being able to receive services together, right? And there's a couple of reasons why we decided that that wasn't the model for us. One reason being that inevitably that location doesn't remain confidential forever. Community members pick up on what's going on, or, abusers figure it out, and then that person is no longer safe to be there. In our model, we have apartments across the county. So if we needed to switch them into a different location, or, if that location had been compromised long-term, we could just not renew that lease. The next part of it is most shelters in North Carolina exclusively serve female identified clients. So for male clients or for transgender clients, you're looking at no options, or for transgender female clients, you're looking at deciding, do I leave this unsafe situation and go to a shelter where I potentially, risk being outed or enduring further harassment or abuse? So many of our clients are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do I go to the shelter space that's available in Alamance County? But I don't have a car. So that means I can't get my kids back and forth to school. So they've got to change school systems. I can't get back and forth to work. So I'm out of a job. I've got to find another one. I can't get my kid back and forth to their little league games. So their sense of stability and community support is eroded. So then do I stay? Do I stay in this abusive situation? And sometimes the conversation is, well, can you stay in your car? Or, can you go to Walmart because they're 24/7, and just kind of be occupied there? Can you stay in the emergency room? Although, you have to pay to park at our emergency room in Chapel Hill. These are the types of conversations we're having. And we know that on average, it takes at least 7 times of attempting to leave before they're able to leave for good. And we don't necessarily define exactly what 7 times or what attempts to leave mean. It could mean, you just started saving up. You just started squirreling away some cash. It could mean maybe you left and you were gone for 2 months. And then you weren't able to sustain it and you had to return. But 7 times is what it says. And so that can be really, really hard for service providers. It can be really hard for law enforcement to continue going back to the same houses and the same situations, the same disturbance calls over and over again. It's exhausting work. But I think the community support that we have found within Orange County has been tremendous, because the Safe Homes program, we started with our first apartment in October 2020, but we're now up to 3. And we do have some support, some money from Town of Chapel Hill, but we, as of last week, raised $1 million. And that came from community members. That came from people who saw the need and were willing to really support folks. Those 3 apartments have been consistently occupied. I can tell you, as part of our DV response team, there have been some unique challenges that nobody anticipated, like clients' children's dropping, the keys down the toilet, or the AC breaking and the landlord not fixing it for a month, or, trying to figure out how to get transportation for the child to take their EOCs when the parent who's living in the apartment doesn't have transportation. But it's made such a difference. And those clients, every single one who we've intaked, or there's not a past tense for that, but when we meet with them, every single client who's received the keys has cried, because it means so much to be somewhere that you feel safe, that you have autonomy over, and that really helps begin to rebuild the power and control that has been lost, that's been stolen from them. So I went through that quickly because I really wanted to be able to chat with you all. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you. And I'm wondering sort of what folks' thoughts are, questions.
Valerie, thank you. That was very informative. Our group usually has some great questions. So folks, if you want to raise your hand in Zoom, or if you want to chat, or if you want to just call it out, all of the above are fine. I'm happy to moderate that if you want to use the chat or the hand raising, but otherwise we can reach out. Questions?
I've got a question, Gavin. I didn't do the hand raise. I'm sorry. Someone may have had their.
Problem. You're good.
Thank you for your presentation. Obviously, tons of information, and really appreciate your time. It seems to me, and I wanted to just ask your opinion, whether or not you think that. I mean, I feel like our society is a very violent society. You know, we glamorize violence, you know, in movies, and TV, and media. And I just wanted to get your perspective in terms of, do you think that physical and sexual violence have been on the rise, has been increasing, you know, let's say over the past generation or two, due to kind of, you know, media bombardment, or do you think it's always been there and, you know, we're just talking about it more now? I just feel like, you know, there's always been violence and, you know, dating back a lot more violent than these days, right? For thousands of years. But in recent history, I just wanted to, interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we operate within a world of gray. You know, that is the work that we do. There is no quick and easy answer to anything. I think that you bring up some really interesting points. So on the one hand, yes, I think that the last generation, right, Generation Z, starting with the very end of the millennials, are oversaturated with representations of violence, with opportunities through video games to enact that out. You know, there are true crime podcasts out the wazoo that frankly, you know, is like trauma porn, you know, and the ability to really hear the intimate details and see the intimate details of what really are people's worst experiences in their lives. And yet we listen to them for entertainment. And so on the one hand, I can see how that can contribute to the uptick in violence. On the other hand, you know, and I guess before I move to that other point, what I'll also say is, you know, when I was in high school, I remember the statistics was 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime, and now it's 1 in 3. And I don't necessarily think, though, that that's attributable to a sudden uptick in violence. I think, you know, alternatively, on the positive end of things, we are changing as a culture in that we are creating a climate where folks are disclosing more often than they had in the past. And so potentially it's always been 1 in 3 or even 1 in 2, I'd argue. And that we're just seeing numbers that are now more fully representative as a result of, you know, movements like Me Too and Time's Up, and things like that. But there's no one easy answer. I think we've got really battling forces. You know, one statistic that I think really hammers it home for me is that for children that grow up in households where they're experiencing domestic violence, girls are 3 times more likely to become victims as adults, and boys are 3 times more likely to become perpetrators. So we're talking about a brother and sister that could grow up in the same household, and yet they have such disparate outcomes. And so what else is going on in our society that leads to that outcome? Like, what expectations are we putting on boys and girls, and what are we telling them that leads to those such different outcomes? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'd love to see more PSAs that, you know, blatantly state that, you know, a lot of people still, you know, spank their children. A lot of people still hit their children. It starts very young. You know, we're very desensitized, as you mentioned. But I'd love to see some public service announcements, you know, so that the same young kids that are watching cartoons on the TV also see advertisements that say, "This is not right. This is not allowed." You know, and I just feel like it's still kind of. I mean, we've brought it a lot more to the forefront, but it's still very much an undiscussed publicly topic. You know, it's something that should be just as important as some of the other movements happening today. So
Brian Keelup has a question.
Valerie, a very disturbing talk there, very informative. Valerie, two questions, please. One is, how does this compare internationally? Have you looked around? Is this particularly endemic here? And secondly, you touched on it a little bit in your answer to Omar there about a particular group and that was abusive parents breed abusive children. Are there any other identifiable groups where this is more prevalent than in other groups? Which groups are most vulnerable?
Yeah, I think you bring up some really important questions and ones that are pretty common. So I'll say that, I think that these numbers are pretty on par for what you would see internationally. I think it's going to depend on what region or what country you're looking at in terms of the resources that they put forth towards studying this and actually accurately capturing what's happening. But I think that this is pretty much on par for what you'd see internationally. And as far as what are some identifiers or what are some things that might be indicators. So I think naturally as humans, we want to explain things. We want to understand why. We want there to be a cause. And unfortunately, there isn't one identifiable factor. I think that abusers abuse because they can. They have seen it work. It is effective. And we are in a society where there are not a lot of systems for accountability, right? As we talked about, we've glorified violence and our legal systems, are overburdened. And so even when there are opportunities to hold people accountable, they're not necessarily taken full advantage of because, our ADAs aren't seeing the cases until they're right in front of them. And I think even in addition to that, I don't know that I'm fully convinced that things like, jail and our prison systems are actually the most effective ways of impacting these issues because again, studies show that people can change, abusers can change. However, that change has to be self-initiated. And so things like mandated abuser treatment programs are actually less effective than programs where folks enroll themselves. One thing that I'll put up just to show, it's a slide that I left out just because I knew we had limited time, but I'll share just so for your own viewing, that these are the indicators of lethality. So these are things that we as advocates are listening for through our conversations because we know that they are indicators that the situation is escalating and that the client is more likely to be killed. Yeah, sorry, if that doesn't fully answer or if I've taken us in too many directions, but.
No, thank you, Valerie. I think you answered beautifully.
Peggy has a question.
I first wanted to thank you. I'm a volunteer at IFC, so I answer the phones, and I cannot tell you the number of times that people have called me up in tears and have no place to go. And when we talk and I find out that there's an abusive situation, I send them to you. So thank you for being there. My other question, well, it's not a question, that was a thank you. So I get to ask my question. I think one of the saddest things is when the victim is killed by someone who's had an order of protection. So my question is, how well do you work with the police? Like, let's say you've moved a victim. Do you let the police know that they're now in this other place and to watch that place? Or do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
You work hand in hand with the police.
So first and foremost, I'll say that, involvement with law enforcement and involvement in any of our services or any other services, it's entirely voluntary. So, our model that is core to everything is the idea of empowerment, that, our clients are the experts on their situation. They know what's going to be safest. And so we're going to take the lead from them. And so if a client chooses to be involved with law enforcement, then we are absolutely supportive of that decision. It is a tool to be used, for some people who feel safe doing so. As far as, like our apartments, those locations are not disclosed to anyone. So the only people who are aware of those apartments and their locations are Compass Center staff. So we don't let law enforcement know where those are. Of course, if there was a situation where a client who was staying in one of those apartments needed to call police, they could absolutely call police, right? And it's not as if law enforcement would know by showing up that, oh, that's one of Compass Center's emergency apartments, right? So, I'd say that the relationship with police in Orange County, we work especially closely with the Sheriff's Department and with Chapel Hill PD. So I think, we are really fortunate to be in a community where, for the most part, our relationship with law enforcement is well established and good. I know that they're around, especially the Black Lives Matter movement. There were some domestic violence agency, I think in Washington state, that came out in support of Black Lives Matter, and their law enforcement agencies decided that they weren't going to work with them any longer. And severed those ties. And so, it varies through communities. And it's a very nuanced relationship. But an important resource for some clients, for sure. And thank you for volunteering. And if any of you all are curious about volunteering at Compass Center, I can tell you about that too.
Nick Vaughn has a question.
Valerie, thanks. That was awesome. Could you give us any pro tips as we're trying to be good parents, good grandparents, members of the community? When we're talking about prevention, can you give us any pointers on things we should be looking to do or not do?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, making your kids know that you're open to having those conversations. So, and approaching them without judgment, without shame, making yourself a resource, sort of that like no questions asked, I'm here kind of thing. And if you're looking for additional resources, we, in addition to the youth empowerment programs we offer to students, we have parent engagement sessions. So there are 4 parent engagement sessions that we held that were sponsored through Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools throughout the school year. And all of those are on our YouTube page. If you're interested in watching those, we talked about pornography and media literacy. We talked about how to maintain healthy relationships for young people in the middle of the pandemic when you're virtual. We talked about supporting LGBTQ youth. There was another one that I can't remember. And we have some youth opportunities coming up this summer for young people to engage in some of this content. There's some parent education and information sessions actually happening next week. And it's been so interesting, to see kind of the community of parents that are supporting one another in these conversations. One, if you're on social media, one Instagram account that I think is amazing is called Sex Positive Families. And don't let the word sex throw you off. I think that the more we can have these conversations, the more, our young people will feel like we're really accessible resources, but they are fantastic and have phenomenal content, and also following us on social media, because each Friday we do posts about young people, and we have a youth empowerment blog on our website that we maintain. So those would be the suggestions I have for kind of continuing education around those things.
Well, we are so grateful, Valerie, for you sharing your time with us today. We thank you for what you're doing in the community. And I very much appreciate you sharing this presentation. We're grateful for you being here today. Folks, thanks so much for joining us today. Great meeting as usual. Look forward to seeing everyone again next week, and hope everyone has a safe weekend. Take